But yes, this should be more 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas from Jules Verne, which, again, I was sort of waiting for more people to show up before I start talking about things within it, but I guess I might as well start. So I was skimming it before reading this afternoon, and there's just a whole chapter that was like full of various content and descriptions that was making me uncomfortable. It's a bit where they're on land. Aronnax, Conseil and Ned Land are all ashore hunting for food, and they do so, and they find all sorts of food. And then the following chapter, the one that I skipped, has them being attacked by natives, and this is the people of Papua New Guinea. And just a lot of the descriptions and the way that the way that Aronnax, particularly because it's kind of written from his perspective, refers to them and talks about them, it was making me uncomfortable. Like, it's not the worst thing's ever been written about people, but it's just kind of persistent, and they're not the sort of thing that's easy to read around or skip, or, you know, if it's like a bad paragraph maybe that doesn't really affect much if you skip past it, or like a word you can substitute for something like indigenous people or native or what have you, then it's, you know, you can sort of get around it. But this was just like the entire chapter was just kind of talking about the people of this island quite unfavourably, and it just sort of didn't seem like something I wanted to broadcast without kind of just as in my position as a white guy, it felt kind of uncomfortable just like broadcasting that without comment. So I thought what I would do is I would just skip it out and preface it instead. So there's a bit where narratively it might jump, and that's kind of what this is. Cheers, Yumika. Also, hey, welcome. And yeah, so I think like to just omit it whilst reading will feel weird. That's why I wanted to say something about it now, so that anyone listening to it, and I'll leave this in the recording as well, and what actually goes up on YouTube, so that it's not skipped out. But yeah, like what happens in that chapter is they're like sitting down to eat food, and stones start getting thrown at them, and they realise that it's the locals who are basically trying to get rid of them. Like, get off the island, it's only fair, you are strangers, you've just got to rocked up and started killing the wildlife and taking the food and lighting fires and stuff. And so yeah, and Aronnax's perspective is kind of like, you know, these people attacking us, how dare they. Does refer to them as savages, which I mentioned because he does so to a bit that I did appreciate is he refers to them as such in front of Captain Nemo, who then corrects him with sort of the admonishment that, frankly, mate, there's savages everywhere in this world. You tell me somewhere that you've gone that hasn't had them, because obviously Nemo has a very dim view of humanity in general and everybody. And so I did appreciate that kind of, like, you know, because the book is written from Aronnax's perspective, and Aronnax himself seems to have quite a few prejudices against people, which is just how society was, I think, in a lot of ways at the time it was written. But yes, I respect at least Nemo correcting him and saying, like, yeah, hold on, it's everyone, like there's people everywhere, you shouldn't really be judging them like this. And there's even a bit where, like, Conseil nearly shoots someone because he was holding a fancy shell, and one of the Papuans lunged for it and tried to take it from him, and Conseil, like, pulls out his gun and takes a shot that misses but kind of clips a bracelet on the person. And Aronnax scolds him and is like, why are you trying to kill him? Like, his life isn't worth that of a shell, you fool, don't do this. And so there is a little bit of, like, perspective and nuance in there, but just as a whole the chapter felt uncomfortable. I didn't particularly want to just broadcast it. So yeah, I figured I'd put I don't know, I want to say lampshade. I don't know if lampshading is the right term for it, but, you know, just like put a kind of sign over that, just say, like, hey, here's what I've done, here's what's happening. And yeah, when I go past that. But yeah, I guess without much more preamble, I have recorded tonight's reading. So what I shall do is, if we're ready to go, I shall go over to that. So it may like jump a little bit at the start because it's not quite going to be seamless going over to there. But yeah. And I'll be back at the end of this to talk us out. So thank you and enjoy. Chapter 21. Some Days Ashore. I was much impressed upon landing. Ned trod the ground as if he had come to take possession. We had been 2 months passengers in the Nautilus, to use Captain Nemo's expression, that is to say, prisoners of the commander. We were soon at gunshot distance from the shore. The soil was almost entirely madreporic, but some dry beds of torrents, scattered with granite debris, betokened the primal formation of the island. The horizon was completely hidden by the woods. Enormous trees, nearly 200 feet high, intertwined by bindweed of the tropics, formed actual hammocks, which were rocked by the gentle breeze. There were mimosas, figs, teaks, hibiscus, palms in mingled profusion, and beneath their verdant shade the orchids, both vegetable and ferny, were growing. But without noticing the beautiful flora, the Canadian abandoned the agreeable for the useful. He perceived a coconut tree. He knocked down a nut, broke it, and we drank the milk. We ate the kernel with a satisfaction which was a mute protest against the Nautilus dinners. "Excellent," said Ned. "Exquisite," replied Conseil. "And I did not think that your Nemo would object to our expedition if he saw the prospect of a cargo of coconuts," said Ned. "I do not believe so myself, but he will not want to taste them," said I. "So much the worse for him," said Conseil. "And the better for us," replied Ned. "There will be more left." "Just one word, Master Land," said I, as he was preparing to attack another tree. "The coconut is a very good thing, but before we fill the launch with them, let us see whether the island does not produce something equally useful. Fresh vegetables will be welcome in the storerooms of the Nautilus." "Monsieur is right," said Conseil, "and I propose to have 3 divisions in the boat. One for fruit, one for vegetables, and one for venison, of which we have hitherto had not the slightest trace." "Conseil, you must never despair of anything," said Ned. "Let us get on," I said, "but keep a sharp lookout. Although the island appears to be uninhabited, it may contain some individuals who will be less hard to please as to the quality of game." "Ha ha!" laughed Ned Land as he moved his jaws significantly. "Well, Ned?" cried Conseil. "Faith," he replied, "I'm beginning to understand the charms of anthropophagy." Ned, what are you saying? You a cannibal? I shall not be safe so near you in the cabin now. Suppose I should wake up some fine morning half-eaten?" "Friend Conseil, I like you very much, but not enough to eat you, unless under the pressure of necessity." "I am not proud," replied Conseil. "Let us go on. We must kill some game to satisfy this cannibal, or one of these mornings Monsieur will only have the fragments of a servant to wait on him." All this time we were penetrating into the wooded glades of the forest. We looked through it in every way. Chance brought about what we desired in this search for vegetables, and one of the most useful products of tropical regions furnished us with an article of food much needed on board. I mean the breadfruit, which is very plentiful in the island of Guberor, and there I noticed the variety without grains, which in Malaya is entitled rima. This tree is distinguished from others by its upright stem, which is about 40 feet high. The top is gracefully rounded, and is composed of large multi-lobed leaves, known to naturalists at once by this artocorpus. From this green mass the fruit detaches itself. It is nearly 4 inches long and of hexagonal form, a most useful vegetable supplied by nature to countries where corn does not grow, and which, without any cultivation, yields its fruit during 8 months of the year. Ned Land was well acquainted with this fruit. He had eaten them on former occasions, and he knew how to prepare them. Thus the sight of them excited a desire to possess them, and he did not long delay the attempt. "Monsieur," he said, "I shall die if I do not taste a little of this breadfruit." "Eat at your leisure, Ned," I replied. "We are here to experimentalize. Get them down." "That will not take long," replied the Canadian, and, armed with a match, he lit a fire of dead wood which crackled joyously. Meantime, Conseil and I chose the best fruits. Some had not yet reached maturity, and their thick skin was covered over with a white fibrous pulp. In other places, great numbers, yellow and gelatinous, had not waited to be gathered. These fruits do not contain noyau. Conseil brought a dozen to Ned Land, who placed them on the fire after cutting them in thick slices. In so doing, he kept saying, "You will see how good the bread will be." "Particularly as we have been so long deprived of it," said Conseil. "It is even better than bread," added the Canadian. "It is like fine pastry. Have you ever eaten it, monsieur?" "No, Ned." "Well then, prepare yourself for something very nice, and if you do not enjoy it, I am no longer the king of harpooners." In a few moments, the part of the fruit exposed to the fire was completely baked. The interior appeared like a white dough, like the crumb of bread. The taste was something like the artichoke. It must be admitted that the bread was excellent, and I ate it with much gusto. "Unfortunately," said I, "it will not keep fresh, and it seems to me useless to attempt to lay in any store of it on board." "Indeed, monsieur," cried Ned, "but you speak as a naturalist. Now, I speak as a baker. Conseil, collect a quantity of those fruits for us to carry on board." "And how will you prepare them?" I asked. "By making a fermented paste with their pulp, which will keep it sweet for an indefinite period. When I want to use the bread, I have only to cook it on board, and, notwithstanding a slightly acid taste, you will find it excellent." "Then, Master Ned, I see that the bread will be all right." "If," replied the Canadian, "we had some fruit and vegetables." "Let us look for them." When our search was ended, we set about completing our dinner. Our efforts were not fruitless, and towards midday we had laid a quantity of bananas. These delicious products of the torrid zone ripen all the year round, and the Malays, who call them pisang, eat them raw. We also found some enormous jacks, somewhat strong in their flavour, savoury mangoes, and ananas of immense size. But this collecting took up a long time, which, however, we did not regret. Conseil kept his eyes upon Ned. The harpooner marched in front, and as he went through the forest, he collected with unerring skill the fruit we required. "Well, now," said Conseil, "you want nothing more, eh?" Replied the Canadian. "What, not satisfied?" "Vegetables and fruit alone do not constitute a meal," said Ned. "They come in at the end like dessert. Where is the soup and the joint?" "In fact," I said, "Ned has promised us cutlets, and they appear to be doubtful." "Monsieur," replied Ned, "not only has our hunting not finished, but it has not even commenced. Patience. We are sure to meet some feathered or hairy animal, if not in this spot, somewhere else." "And if not here today, it will be here tomorrow," added Conseil, "for it cannot be far off. I vote we return to the boat." "What, already?" exclaimed Ned. "We ought to be back before night," I said. "But what time is it now?" asked Ned. "About 2 o'clock," replied Conseil. "How quickly time passes on firm ground," said Ned Land with a sigh. "Let us return," said Conseil. We again passed through the forest, and completed our supply of provisions by making a raid upon the cabbage palms, which we had to climb up to obtain the fruit, some small beans, which I recognized as the abru of the Malays, and some excellent yams. We were overloaded when we reached the launch, nevertheless still found the supply insufficient. But fortune favoured him. As we were embarking, he caught sight of some trees which appeared to be a species of palm. These trees are justly reckoned amongst the most useful of the Malayan products. They were sago trees. They grew naturally without culture, and were reproduced, like the mulberry, by their shoots and seeds. Ned Land knew how to treat them. He seized a hatchet and, working with great determination, he soon felled 2 or 3 sago trees, whose maturity he recognized by the white dust powdering their leaves. I watched him from a naturalist's point of view rather than as a hungry man. He began by raising a strip of bark about 1 inch thick from each tree, which covered a network of long fibres, forming inextricable knots, which were cemented together by a sort of gummy farine. This was the sago which forms a principal article of food amongst the Malays. Ned Land, for the moment, only cut the trees in pieces as for firewood, intending to extract the sago later by separating it from the fibrous ligatures, evaporating the water by the sun's heat, and leaving it to harden in the moulds. At length, about 5 p.m, laden with our treasures, we quitted the island, and half an hour later climbed on board the Nautilus. No one was to be seen. The vessel appeared deserted. We embarked our provisions. I descended to my room, where I found my supper prepared. I ate it and went to bed. Next morning, the 6th of January, nothing new appeared on board. No sound was heard, not a sign of life. The launch lay alongside as we had left it. We resolved to return to the island. Ned Land was hoping to be more successful as a hunter than he had been the day before, and wished to visit another portion of the forest. At sunrise we were en route. The boat, assisted by the tide, soon reached the island. We disembarked, and thinking it better to trust the instinct of the Canadian, we followed Ned Land, whose long legs threatened to distance us. He took his course towards the west. Then, finding some torrents, he gained the high ground, which is surrounded by beautiful woods. Some kingfishers darted along the watercourses, but would not allow us to approach them. Their caution was to me evidence that they were acquainted with mankind, and if the island was not actually inhabited, it was frequently visited by human beings. Having crossed an immense grass prairie, we reached the edge of a little wood, which resounded with the songs and rustlings of a quantity of birds. "They are nothing but birds," said Conseil. "But there is something to be eaten," replied the harpooner. "Not at all," replied Conseil, "for I can see nothing but parrots." "Friend Conseil," said Ned gravely, "a parrot becomes a pheasant to those who have nothing but parrots to eat." "And I will add," said I, "that nicely prepared they are worth eating." A whole race of parrots were flitting from branch to branch beneath the thick foliage of this wood, and only required a little careful teaching to be able to speak. They chattered with paroquets of all colours, grave cockatoos, which seemed to be considering some problem. The loris, of a beautiful scarlet, darted like a bit of stamen carried by the wind, and every variety of bird, beautiful to behold, but not usually good to eat. Nevertheless, there was one bird wanting, which never passes the limits of the Aru and the Papuan Islands, but fate had decreed that I should admire it before long. We crossed through a thicket and found ourselves on a plain sprinkled with clumps of bushes. I then saw get up some beautiful birds, whose long feathers obliged them to fly against the wind. Their undulating flight, their graceful curves and their aerial course, the varying play of colour, attracted and charmed the eye. I had no difficulty to recognize them. "These are birds of paradise!" I cried. "Order sparrows, section clistomores," said Conseil. "Family partridges?" inquired Ned Land. "I do not know, Master Land. Nevertheless, I count upon your skill to procure one of them." "I can try, though I am more accustomed to handle a harpoon than a gun." The Malays, who drive a great trade in these birds with the Chinese, have various methods of catching them, which we could not employ. Sometimes they fix snares at the top of the high trees for which the birds of paradise have a preference. Sometimes they secure them with a kind of bird lime. They sometimes even poison the pools where the birds drink, but we were reduced to taking flying shots at them, which left us little chance of success, and in fact we did expend some of our ammunition in vain. Towards 11 o'clock we had crossed the hills which rise in the centre of the island, and had hitherto killed nothing. Hunger began to attack us. The sportsmen had trusted to the produce of their skill and had been mistaken. Fortunately, Conseil, to his own great amazement, fired right and left and secured our breakfast. He killed a white pigeon and a wood pigeon, which quickly were plucked and, suspended to a stick, were roasted over a fire of dead wood. While these interesting fowls were cooked, Ned prepared the breadfruit, and the pigeons were eaten. The pigeons were eaten, the bones picked, and the meal declared excellent. The nutmeg upon which they feed perfumes their flesh and gives it a pleasant flavour. "It is as if the fowls had been fed upon truffles," said Conseil. "Now, Ned, what do you want?" I said. "Some four-footed game, Monsieur Aronnax," he replied. "All these pigeons are only side dishes and whets for the appetite, so until I have killed some animal available for cutlets, I shall not be satisfied." "Nor shall I, Ned, unless I catch a bird of paradise." "Let us go, then," replied Conseil, "but in the direction of our boat. We have reached the first mountains, and I think it will be better to re-enter the forest." This was sensible advice, and was followed. After an hour's walking, we reached a regular forest of sago trees. Some harmless serpents fled at our approach. The birds of paradise disappeared, and I was beginning to despair of getting a specimen, when Conseil, who was ahead, stooped suddenly, uttered a triumphant cry, and came back to me carrying a magnificent bird of paradise. "Bravo, Conseil!" I cried. "Monsieur is very good," replied Conseil. "Not at all, my lad. You have made a masterstroke to catch one of those birds alive in your hand. If Monsieur will examine it more nearly, he will see that there is nothing very wonderful in it after all." "Why, Conseil?" "Because the bird is drunk as an owl." "Drunk?" "Yes, sir. Intoxicated with the nutmegs under the tree where I took him. Just see, friend Ned, the terrible effects of intemperance." "A thousand devils!" exclaimed the Canadian. "It is rather hard to reproach me with intemperance, I who have not tasted spirits for 2 months." Meanwhile, I was examining this curious bird. Conseil was right. The bird of paradise, intoxicated by the heady juice, had become helpless. It could not fly, scarcely walk. But that did not trouble me at all, and I let it get over it. This bird belongs to the most beautiful of the 8 species which are found in Papua and the neighbouring islands. This was the emerald bird of paradise, one of the rarest. It measures nearly a foot in length. Its head is relatively small. Its eyes are placed near the opening of the beak and are likewise small, but it presents a wonderful combination of colour. The beak is yellow, the feet and claws brown, hazel wings tipped with purple at their extremities, pale yellow on the head and behind the neck, throat emerald green, and the chest and stomach is a fine maroon. 2 curved and soft feathers growing above the tail and prolonged in beautiful light and lengthy plumes of admirable softness complete the ensemble of this wonderful bird, which the natives call the bird of the sun. I was anxious to bring back this lovely specimen to Paris and to present it to the Jardin des Plantes, where there was not a living one. "Is it, then, so very uncommon?" asked the Canadian, in the tone of a hunter who did not regard game from the artistic point of view. "Very rare, indeed, and above all very difficult to catch alive, and even dead these birds are the object of much business traffic. So the natives have conceived the idea of making them up, as people might imitate diamonds or pearls." "What?" exclaimed Conseil. "Fabricate birds of paradise?" "Yes, Conseil." "Can Monsieur explain the process?" "Certainly. During the east monsoon, these birds lose their magnificent plumage, which surrounds the tail. These are the feathers which are collected by the false traffickers in birds, and which they fix cleverly to some unfortunate paroquet, previously mutilated for the purpose. Then they dye the suture, varnish the bird, and export to the museums, the amateurs in Europe, the result of their industry." "Well, at any rate," said Ned, if you have not got the bird, you have got his feathers, and so long as you don't want to eat the animal, it is no great matter." But if my wishes were satisfied in the possession of the bird of paradise, Ned's were not so. Happily, during the afternoon, he shot a magnificent wild pig, which the natives call bari utang. This animal came in very opportunely, and was welcomed accordingly. Ned Land was very proud of his shooting. The pig, touched by the electric bullet, had fallen dead on the instant. The Canadian prepared him in workmanlike manner, after having taken some cutlets from him for our evening meal. Then the chase was resumed, which was further distinguished by the exploits of Conseil and Ned Land. These two, by beating, roused a herd of kangaroo, which bounded away as actively as usual. They did not fly so rapidly as the electric bullets, which checked their bounding career. "Aha, Professor!" cried Ned, into whose head the sportsman's passion for killing had mounted. "What excellent game, particularly stewed! What a provision for the Nautilus! 2, 3, 5 head, and when I think that we are eating all this fresh meat and the idiots on board have not a crumb." In the excess of his joy, the Canadian, if he had not talked so much, would have slain the whole herd, but he was content with a dozen of these marsupials, which form the first order of aplacentary mammifers, as Conseil told us. These animals were small. They were a species of the rabbit kangaroo, which live in the trees, and whose rapidity of movement is extreme, but if only a medium height, they furnish excellent food. We were very well pleased with the results of our hunting. The delighted Ned proposed to return again upon the following morning, with a view to depopulate all the game, but he was reckoning without his host. At 6 p.m. we arrived at the shore. Our boat was as we had left it. The Nautilus, like a great rock, rose up from the waves about 2 miles off. Ned Land at once occupied himself with respecting the important question of dinner. He understood the cooking part of this very well. The cutlets, grilled upon the wood embers, soon spread a delicious odour around us, and I perceived that I was following Ned in this. Here was I delighted at the prospect of pork chops. I trust I may be forgiven, even as I forgave Master Land, for the same reason. In fact, the dinner was a success. The pigeons wound up this, to us, extraordinary meal. The sago pate, the breadfruit, some mangoes, half a dozen bananas, some fermented coconut milk put us in good trim. I really believe that the ideas of my worthy companions were not altogether so clear as they might have been. "Suppose we do not return to the Nautilus tonight," said Conseil. "Suppose we don't return to the Nautilus at all," added Ned Land. At this moment, a large stone fell at our feet and cut short the harpooner's suggestion. And the next one is Chapter 22, Captain Nemo's Lightning, which I will skip past. Chapter 23, Egrisomnia. On the following day, 10th of January, the Nautilus resumed her course beneath the waves at a speed which surprised me, and which could not have been less than 35 miles an hour. The revolutions of her screw were too rapid to admit of being reckoned. When I thought of this marvellous electric agency which gave light, heat, and movement to the Nautilus, protected her from attack, and transformed it into an ark, into which no one could enter without running the risk of death by lightning, my admiration knew no bounds. The machine was worthy of the hand that made it. We proceeded due west, and on the 11th of January we doubled Cape Wessel, situated in 135 degrees east longitude and 10 degrees north latitude, which forms the eastern point of the Gulf of Carpentaria. The reefs were numerous, but easily distinguished, and shown upon the map with great accuracy. Also, Joey has just entered the room, so say hi to the cat. The Nautilus easily avoided the breakers of Money to larboard and the Victoria Reefs to starboard, situated in 130 degrees longitude, and on the 10th parallel, which we steadily followed. On the 13th of January, Captain Nemo reached the Timor Sea, and sighted the island of that name in 122 degrees longitude. This island is ruled by the Rajas. These princes call themselves the sons of crocodiles, that is to say, descended from the highest rank to which human nature can lay claim. So these scaly ancestors abounded in the streams and were the object of peculiar veneration. The people protected them, petted them, worshipped them, and fed them, even giving them their young children to eat. And woe to the stranger who raised his hand against these sacred lizards. The Nautilus now went southwest and bore up for the Indian Ocean. Whither was Captain Nemo taking us? Was he about to run up the Asian coasts and towards Europe? This was not likely to be the idea of a man who kept aloof from inhabited continents. Would he descend to the southward, double the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, and advance to the Antarctic regions? Or would he return to the Pacific, where the Nautilus found easy and independent navigation? Time would show. Having skirted the rocks of Cartier, Hibernia, Seringapatam, and Scott, the last barriers of the land against the water, on the 14th of January we were beneath all lands. The speed of the Nautilus was slackened, and she became very capricious in her movements, sometimes sailing beneath and sometimes at the surface of the water. During this portion of the trip, Captain Nemo made some very interesting observations respecting the temperature of the sea at different depths. Under ordinary circumstances, the results are obtained by means of complicated instruments, and are at least doubtful as regards the theometric soundings, as the glasses frequently break under the presence of the water, or of those appearances based upon the principle of the variation of the resistance of metals to the electric currents. The results thus obtained cannot be really depended upon. Captain Nemo, on the contrary, went down to ascertain the temperature in those depths, and his thermometer, put in communication with the various zones of liquid, gave him surely and immediately the looked-for temperature. Thus it was, whether in filling the reservoirs or in descending obliquely by means of the inclined planes, the Nautilus attained successively the depths of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000, and 10,000 yards, and the definite result of these experiences was that the sea gave a permanent temperature of 4.5 degrees at a depth of 1,000 yards in all latitudes. I followed his experiments with the greatest interest. Captain Nemo was passionately fond of this work. I often wondered what was the use of all these observations. Was it for the benefit of his fellow creatures? This was not likely, for some day or other his work would perish with him in some unknown sea. It was not likely that he destined them for me, as that would be to admit that my strange voyage would have an end, and this termination I did not yet perceive. However, Captain Nemo made me equally acquainted with himself some various results obtained by him, and which established the agreement of the densities of the water in the principal seas. From this communication I drew a personal lesson which had nothing scientific about it. On the morning of the 15th of January, the captain, with whom I was walking on the platform, asked me if I knew the different densities of seawater. I replied in the negative, and I added that exact observations on the subject had not been recorded. "I have made such observations, and I can vouch for their accuracy," said the captain. "Very good," said I, "but the Nautilus is a world in itself, and the secrets of its wise men have not reached terra firma." "You are right, Professor," he replied after a pause. "It is a world apart. It is as great a stranger to the earth as the planets which accompany the globe around the sun, and the earth does not yet know the secrets of the savants in Saturn and Jupiter. However, since chance has thrown us together, I will tell you the result of my observations." "I am all attention, Captain." "You know," said Captain Nemo, "that salt water is more dense than fresh water, but this density is not uniform. For example, if I represent the density of fresh water by I find I 23/1000 as the density of the Atlantic, I 26/1000 that of the Pacific, 31/1000 that of the Mediterranean. Ah, thought I, he has sailed in the Mediterranean. In the Ionian Sea, I 18/1000 and I 29/1000 in the Adriatic. The Nautilus certainly did not avoid the crowded seas of Europe, and I judged from this that it would carry us, perhaps before very long, towards the more civilized lands. I fancied that Ned Land would appreciate this very highly. For a long time the days passed in experiments of all kinds, to ascertain the saltiness of the seawater at different temperatures, its electrization, its coloration, its transparency, and under all circumstances Captain Nemo displayed an ingenuity which was only equalled by his great politeness to me. Then, for many days I did not see him, and I remained almost isolated on board. On the 16th of January, the Nautilus appeared to sleep at a few meters only beneath the surface. The electric apparatus was not at work, and the screw being immovable, she drifted at the will of the currents. I supposed that the machinery was being repaired, such a course necessary after the late violent working. My companions and I were witness of a curious spectacle that day. The side panels of the saloon were open, and, as the lamp of the Nautilus was not alight, a vague obscurity reigned in the water. The stormy and clouded sky could give but little light, even to the first beds of the waters. I was observing the sea under these conditions, and the largest fish only appeared like indistinct masses, when the Nautilus was suddenly in a bright zone of light. I at first believed that the electric light had been set going, and was thus illuminating the surrounding sea, but I was mistaken, and soon perceived my error. The Nautilus was floating in the midst of a phosphorescent zone, which in the prevailing obscurity became dazzling. This was produced by myriads of luminous animalcules, whose sparkling increased as they glided against the metallic hull of the vessel. I could perceive spots of light in the midst of this luminous sheet, like the lumps of iron in a furnace when the metal is at a white heat, and sometimes, on the contrary, certain luminous portions would become dark in the midst of the brilliant mass, from which all shade had apparently been banished. No, this was not the calm irradiation of our usual light. There was a vigour and an unwonted movement in it all. It was a living light. In fact, it was an innumerable collection of Pelagian Infusoria, of noctiluqueous glands, regular globules of diaphanous jelly, provided with a filiform tentacle, and of which animals there are about 25,000 in 30 cubic centimetres of water, and their light was doubly increased by the gleams of medusae, the asteroids and other phosphorescent zoophytes impregnated with the oily substance of organic matter decomposed in the sea, or perhaps with the mucus secreted by the fish. For a long time the Nautilus continued to float in these brilliant waves, and our admiration was increased at perceiving great marine animals disporting themselves like salamanders. I saw in that fire which did not burn the elegant and rapid porpoise, indefatigable clown of the sea, and swordfish 3 yards long, those intelligent prophets of storms, whose formidable weapons now and then struck the glass of the saloon panels. Smaller fish also appeared, which flashed amidst the luminous waters. There was a fascination in this dazzling spectacle. Perhaps some atmospherical condition increased the brilliancy of the phenomenon. Some storm, perhaps, from which the Nautilus, so low down, was secure, and so lay peacefully in the midst of calm waters. Thus we proceeded, incessantly being charmed by some new marvel. Conseil observed and classed the zoophytes, the articulates, the mollusks and fish. The days passed rapidly away, and I no longer took note of them. Ned, as usual, employed himself in finding out some additions to our table. Like snails, we were fastened to our shell, and I can state that it is not difficult to become a perfect snail. Therefore, this life appeared to us easy and natural, and we were no longer thinking of a different existence on land, when an event suddenly recalled us to the strangeness of our position. On the 18th of January, the Nautilus was in longitude 105 degrees and 15 degrees south latitude. The weather was threatening, the sea rough, and the wind blew strongly from the east. The barometer had for some days predicted an approaching storm. I was on the platform when the mate was taking the usual angles. I was awaiting, as usual, for the customary sentence to be pronounced, but that morning another phrase, equally incomprehensible, was uttered. Almost immediately I saw Captain Nemo approach and direct his glass towards the horizon. For some minutes the captain remained motionless, without taking his eyes from the telescope. He then dropped the glass and exchanged a few words with his mate. He appeared to be the prey of an irrepressible emotion, but Captain Nemo, more master of himself, remained cool and collected. He seemed, moreover, to be making certain objections, to which the mate responded by formal assurances. So, at least I fancied, judging from their voices and gestures. I had been carefully looking in the direction indicated without discovering anything. The sea and sky met without any intervening object to break the continuity. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo walked up and down the platform without noticing me, perhaps without being aware of my presence. His step was firm, but less regular than usual. Sometimes he stopped, folded his arms across his chest, and gazed fixedly at the sea. What could he be seeking in that immense expanse? The Nautilus was then some hundreds of miles from the nearest land. The mate had taken up the glass and swept the horizon, going and coming, stamping his feet, and contrasting generally with his chief in the nervous agitation of his manner. However, the mystery was about to be cleared up, and before long, for by the captain's order the screw was set going at a great rate. At this moment, the mate again attracted the captain's attention. Captain Nemo stopped in his walk and levelled his glass in the direction indicated. He gazed for a long time steadily. I was now somewhat disturbed, and descending to the saloon, brought up an excellent telescope which I was in the habit of using. Then, resting the glass upon the cage forward, I disposed my eye to observe the sea and sky. But scarcely had I applied my eye to the telescope when it was snatched from my grasp. I turned round. Captain Nemo stood before me, but I scarcely recognized him. His face was completely altered. His eyes, flashing with a lurid light, glanced at me beneath his frowning brows. His mouth was half open, his body was rigid, his hands clenched, his head bowed between his shoulders, all bearing testimony to the violent emotion that possessed him. He did not move an inch. My glass, fallen from his hand, rolled to his feet. What had happened that I had thus unwittingly provoked his anger? Did he imagine that I had discovered some secret interdicted from the guest of the Nautilus? No, I was not the object of his hatred, for he was not looking at me, but gazing steadily on the particular portion of the horizon. At length he became calm. His face and figure resumed their usual impassibility. He spoke some words to the mate in the unknown tongue, and then he turned to me. "Monsieur Aronnax," he said, in a somewhat haughty tone, "I would recall your attention to one of the conditions I imposed upon you." "What is the question, Captain?" "You and your companions must be content to be incarcerated until I shall judge it desirable to release you." "You are the master here," I replied, looking at him steadily, "but may I ask you a question?" "No, monsieur." There was no disputing this. I had not to discuss, but to obey. Any resistance was impossible. I descended into the cabin occupied by Conseil and Ned, and told them of the captain's resolve. I will leave you to imagine how my tidings were received by the Canadian. However, there was no time for explanations. 4 of the crew appeared at the door and conducted us to the cell in which we had passed our first night on board the Nautilus. Ned Land wished to expostulate, but the door was shut upon him for all reply. "Will monsieur tell me what all this means?" asked Conseil. I related all that had passed. They were as much astonished, but no more enlightened than I was. I fell into a reverie, and the strange expression of fear in Captain Nemo's face haunted me. I was quite incapable of putting two logical ideas together, and I had lost myself in the most absurd hypotheses when I was aroused by Ned saying, "Hello, breakfast is served!" And as a fact, the table was prepared. Captain Nemo had evidently given this order at the time he directed the increase of speed. "Will Monsieur permit me to recommend him something?" "Yes, Conseil," I replied. "Well, then, I recommend that Monsieur eat his breakfast. It is prudent. We do not know what may happen." "You are right, Conseil." "Unfortunately," said Ned, "they have only given us ship's fare." "Friend Ned," said I, "what would you have done had there been no breakfast at all?" This remark put an end to the harpooner's grumbling. We sat down and ate in silence. I ate little. Conseil forced himself to eat, as a matter of prudence, and Ned Land nevertheless did not lose a mouthful. Then, breakfast over, we rested on the table as we sat. Just then, the luminous globes were extinguished, and we were left in utter darkness. Ned Land went to sleep on the spot, and, to my astonishment, Conseil also yielded to a heavy drowsiness. I was wondering what had caused this sudden accession of sleep in him when I felt my brain affected by a drowsy feeling. My eyes closed in spite of all my efforts to the contrary. I became a prey to a terrible hallucination. Evidently, some soporific had been mixed with the food we had eaten. It was therefore not enough to imprison us to prevent the betrayal of Captain Nemo's secret. It was necessary to drug us as well. I heard the panels shut. The undulation of the water ceased. The Nautilus had then quitted the surface of the ocean. Was she, again, descending to the motionless zones of the seas? I tried to resist sleep. It was impossible. My breathing became weaker. I felt a death-like chill extend over my frame. My eyelids fell over my eyes like lumps of lead. I could not raise them. A morbid trance and full of fancies took possession of my whole being. Then the visions disappeared and left me completely prostrated. Chapter 24. The Realms of Coral. Next day I awoke, and my head was wonderfully clear. To my great surprise, I was in my own room. My companions, doubtless, had been taken to their cabin without being more aware of the transfer than I was. They were quite as ignorant as I was, respecting the occurrences of the night, and I could only hope that chance would develop the mystery at some future time. I then thought I would leave my chamber, but was I free or still a prisoner? Free. I opened the door and went out upon the central staircase. The panels were now open. I reached the platform. Ned Land and Conseil met me there. I questioned them. They knew nothing. Wrapped in such a heavy slumber that they remembered nothing, they had been much surprised to find themselves in their cabin. All this time the Nautilus was as quiet and mysterious as ever. It floated at the surface and progressed slowly. Nothing was changed on board. Ned Land kept his eyes fixed upon the sea. It was deserted. The Canadian signalled nothing new. No land, not even a sail. The west wind blew stiffly, and the long waves gave a perceptible motion to the Nautilus. After the air had been renewed, we descended to a depth of 15 meters, so that we might quickly return to the surface. This operation, contrary to custom, was often performed during the day. The mate then ascended to the platform, and the usual phrase was transmitted to the interior of the vessel. Captain Nemo did not appear. Of all the ship's company, I saw the impassible steward, who waited on me with his usual punctuality and silence. About 2 o'clock I was in the saloon arranging my notes when the captain entered. I saluted him. He acknowledged my greeting in an almost imperceptible manner, but did not speak. I resumed my occupation, hoping that he would offer some explanation of the events of the preceding night. He said nothing. I looked at him attentively. he appeared fatigued. His eyes had not been refreshed by sleep, and his face expressed a deep sadness, a real sorrow. He moved about, seated himself, then got up again, took up any book that came to hand, threw it down again immediately, looked at his instruments vacantly, and appeared thoroughly restless. At length he came to me and said, "Are you a doctor, Monsieur Aronnax?" I paused a little at this unexpected question. "Are you a doctor?" repeated Captain Nemo. "Many of your colleagues have studied medicine, Gratiolet, Moquin-Tandon, and others." "Well, in fact," I said, "I am a doctor and a house surgeon. I practiced many months before I entered the museum." "Good," was the reply. My answer evidently satisfied the captain, but not knowing what might come of it, I waited for further questions, resolving my reply according to circumstances. "Monsieur Aronnax," said the captain, "will you extend your skills to one of my men?" "There is an invalid on board, then?" "Yes." "I am ready. Come with me." I confessed that my heart was beating. I do not know why I perceived some connection between this patient and the events of the preceding day, and the mystery troubled me at least as much as the sick man. Captain Nemo led me abaft into the cabin close to the men's quarters. There lay a man about 40 years old, a determined face too, a regular Anglo-Saxon. I knelt beside him. He was not only a sick but a wounded man. His head was wrapped in blood-stained bandages and lay on a double pillow. I took off the bandages, and the wounded man, gazing at me with his great round eyes, made no sign and uttered no complaint. The wound was fearful. The skull, fractured by some blunt instrument, had laid the brain bare, and the cerebral substance had suffered complete attrition. Some clots of blood had formed within the mass, which was like the dregs of wine. There was a contusion and concussion of the brain here. The breathing of the patient was laboured, and spasmodic movements agitated his features. The cerebral phlegmasia was complete, and induced paralysis both of body and mind. I felt the sick man's pulse. It was intermittent. The extremities were already cold, and I could perceive that death was approaching without any possibility of my staying its approach. Having dressed his wounds, I readjusted the bandages, and, turning to Captain Nemo, said, "How did this man come by this hurt?" "What matters?" he replied evasively. "The Nautilus struck and broke one of the levers of the engine, which struck this man. But what is your opinion?" I hesitated. "You may speak fearlessly. He does not understand French." I looked again steadily at the wounded man. "He will not live 2 hours longer," I said. "Can nothing save him?" "Nothing." Captain Nemo clenched his hand, and tears glittered in his eyes, which I did not think were made to weep. For some minutes I kept looking at the dying man as his life ebbed away. His paleness appeared more ghastly beneath the electric light that illuminated his deathbed. I looked at that intellectual head, and the face seemed furrowed by premature wrinkles, which sin, or perhaps trouble, had placed there long ago. I endeavoured to learn the secret of his life from the last words that escaped his lips. "You can retire, Monsieur Aronnax," said the captain. I left him in the cabin of the dying man, and regained my own room, which, so very much impressed by the scene I had witnessed. All day I was haunted by sinister presentiments. At night I slept little, and amid my frequently interrupted dreams I fancied I heard distant sighings and the sound of a funeral hymn. Was it the prayer for the dead, uttered in that language which I did not understand? Next morning I went on deck. Captain Nemo was there before me. So soon as he saw me he approached and said, "Would it be convenient for you to make a submarine excursion today?" "With my friends?" I asked. "They can go if they like." "We are at your orders, Captain." "Will you then put on your diver's dresses, please?" There was no question of the dying or the dead. I told Conseil and Ned Land what Captain Nemo had suggested. Conseil was anxious to go, and the Canadian appeared very willing to accompany him. It was at 8 o'clock a.m. At 8:30 we were equipped for our expedition and furnished with the lighting and breathing apparatus. The double door was opened, and accompanied by the captain and followed by a dozen of the crew, we trod at a depth of 10 yards upon the ground where the Nautilus was firmly reposing. A gentle slope led us to the bottom much furrowed. So it led us to a bottom much furrowed and about 15 fathoms down. This ground was very different from that which we had first met with beneath the Pacific Ocean. Here was no fine sand, no submarine prairies nor forests. I immediately recognized that wonderful region of which Captain Nemo did the honors. It was the kingdom of coral. In the branch of zoophytes, in the class of Alaeonares, we marked the order of Gorgonares, which includes the 3 groups of Gorgonians, the Insidians, and the Corallines. It is to the last named that the coral is attributed, a curious substance which has been classed by turns in the animal, mineral, and vegetable kingdoms. A remedy with the ancients, an ornament in modern days. It was only in 1694 that Peysonnel classified it definitely in the animal kingdom. Coral is a conglomeration of animalcules united on a natural, brittle, and stony polypary. These polyps have a single generator, which produces them by a budding process. They have a separate existence, while participating in a common life. It is a kind of natural solecism. I had read the latest works upon this curious zoophyte, which mineralizes itself in growing like a tree, following the very just observation of naturalists, and nothing could be more interesting to me than to visit one of these petrified forests, which nature has planted at the bottom of the sea. The Rumpkorp apparatus were set going, and we followed a coral bank in course of formation, which in time will form a barrier to this part of the Indian Ocean. The way was by the side of inextricable thickets, formed by the entanglement of the branches which covered the little starry flowers with white rays, only, inverse to the plants of the earth, those fixed to the rocks all grew downwards. The lights we carried produced 1,000 beautiful effects amid those coloured branches. It appeared to me that the membranous and cylindrical tubes trembled at the undulation of the water. I was tempted to collect some of these beautiful fresh corals, with such delicate tentacles, some newly opened, some just sprouting, which the fish, with rapid fins, moved as they passed, as a bird might move the twigs of the trees. But as my hand approached these living flowers, these sensitive plants, all were immediately on the alert. The white corals retired into their red cases, the flowers disappeared from my sight, and the coppice was changed into a block of stony hills. Chance put me in the possession of the most valuable specimens of this zoophyte. The coral is equal to that found in the Mediterranean, on the French, Italian, and Barbary coasts. It fully justifies the names of fleur de sang and écume de sang, which trade has bestowed upon the most beautiful kinds. Coral is sold at 500 francs the kilogram, and in this spot the beds would have made the fortunes of 1,000 fishers. The valuable material, often mixed with other polyps, formed the compound called macchiota, and amongst which I remarked some splendid specimens of rose coral. But the bushes soon became smaller, and the tree growths increased. A petrified underwood and long fantastic arches opened before us. Captain Nemo penetrated beneath a dark gallery, whose gentle descent led us to a depth of 100 yards. The lights at times produced magical effects, and caught the angles and projections of these natural arcades, until they appeared tipped with fire. Amidst the branching corallines I noticed other polyps no less curious. Melites, articulated iris, some tufts of corallines, some red, some green, true algae, crusted in their calcareous salts, which naturalists, after much discussion, have definitively ranged in the vegetable kingdom. But in the words of a deep thinker, Perhaps the real point to get at is where the life obscurely rises from the stony sleep, without being yet detached from this rude starting point. After about 2 hours walking, we attained a depth of about 300 yards, that is to say the extreme limit at which coral begins to form. But here was no thicket nor modest bush, but an immense forest of coral, enormous petrified trees. We passed freely underneath the high branches which were lost in the shade of the waves, while at our feet the tuberpores, meandrines, fungi, etc. formed a flowing carpet sprinkled with sparkling gems. It was an indescribable sight. Oh, that we could have exchanged confidences! Why were we imprisoned in this headpiece of metal and glass? Why could we not speak to each other? Why could we not live like the fish, or even like the amphibious animals which for hours can roam at will in the domains of land or water? Meantime, Captain Nemo had stopped. We all followed his example, and, turning round, I perceived that the men had formed themselves in a semicircle round their chief, and, looking more closely, I perceived that 4 of them carried something on their shoulders. We had arrived at a large open space in the coral forest. Our lamps threw around this clearing a sort of twilight, which cast long shadows on the ground. Beyond the reach of our lamps, the darkness was profound, and only here and there a gleam fell upon the points of the coral. Ned Land and Conseil were close to me. We looked on, and it appeared to me that I was about to take part in a very curious drama. On examining the ground, I saw that it was heaped up in places, and these heaps were disposed with a regularity which betrayed man's handiwork. In the midst of the clearing, upon a pedestal of rocks piled up to great height, was a cross of coral, and its long, extended arms looked almost like petrified blood. At a sign from Captain Nemo, one of the men advanced, and at some paces from the cross he began to dig a hole with a pickaxe which he detached from his girdle. I understood it all. This clearing was a cemetery, this hole a grave, that long object the body of the man who had died during the night. Captain Nemo and his men had come hither to bury their companion in this their common resting place at the bottom of the ocean. Never had my mind been so impressed. Never had more impressive thoughts crowded my brain. I did not wish to see what was being enacted before me. Meanwhile, the grave was being slowly excavated. The fish fled hither and thither. I heard the iron ring upon the calcareous ground, and sometimes a spark would break forth as the pick came in contact with some lost piece of silex. The hole extended and widened, and was soon sufficiently large to receive the body. The bearers then approached. The corpse, wrapped in white byssus, was laid in the damp tomb. Captain Nemo, with folded arms, and all the friends of the dead man, knelt down. I and my companions knelt also. The grave was then covered with the debris which had been dug out, and which thus formed a slight mound. When this had been done, Captain Nemo and his men rose up, and, approaching the grave, all bent the knee once more, and waved a last adieu to their dead friend. The funeral procession then returned to the Nautilus, repassing in its way beneath the arcades and the long bush-like formations of the coral. At length the light appeared burning on board. The long gleam led us to the Nautilus. At 1 o'clock we had regained the ship. As soon as I had changed my dress, I ascended to the platform, and, beset by a crowd of mingled feelings, I sat down near the lighting apparatus. Captain Nemo joined me. I got up and said, "So, as I warned you, the man died during the night?" "Yes, Monsieur Aronnax," he replied. "And he now rests among his companions in the cemetery of coral?" "Yes, forgotten by all, except us. We have dug his grave, and the polyps will take care to seal up our dead forever." and hiding his face in his hard hands, the captain tried in vain to conceal a tear. Then he added, "It is our most peaceful burying ground, some hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the waves. Your dead sleep there tranquilly at least, out of reach of sharks." "Yes," replied the captain gravely, "out of the reach of sharks and men." End of part 1. And that is where I shall take a break. So go get up, stretch, walk around, cycle your fluids and such, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Bye for now. Hello and welcome back. I trust that you have had a good break. A little bit weird because obviously this is the pre-recorded section, so I'm not currently able to interact in chat, but yes, very good comments everyone. Love the emotes you've been using, very funny. Lol and etc. But yeah, I shall now, having suitably broken, I'm not sure, I shall now continue with, we have now hit part 2 of the book, which, yeah, it's about halfway through. So worry not, we've got plenty more of this to come. But, yeah, this is part 2, chapter 1, the Indian Ocean. We now commence the second part of the voyage under the sea. The first ended with that sad scene at the cemetery of coral, which left a deep impression on my mind. Thus, then in the bosom of the deep sea, the life of Captain Nemo was entirely past, and he had even prepared his last resting place in the most impenetrable of the abysses. There, no ocean monster will ever disturb the last sleep of these companions of the Nautilus, of those friends united in death as in their lives. Nor will any man forever, the captain had added, always the same strange implacable defiance towards mankind. For my part, I was not any more contented by the hypothesis which satisfied Conseil. He persisted in taking the commander of the Nautilus for one of those mistaken savants who return man's indifference by dislike. So to Conseil the captain was an eccentric genius, who, disgusted by the falseness of earthly things, had been obliged to take refuge in the inaccessible seas, where he could exercise his tastes freely. But, in my opinion, this idea only explained one of these sides of Captain Nemo's character. In fact, the mystery of the night during which we had been imprisoned and drugged, the precaution so violently taken by Captain Nemo to snatch the telescope from my grasp, the mortal wound inflicted upon the sailor by some unexplained collision of the Nautilus, all these things led me into a new vein of thought. No, Captain Nemo did not content himself by merely avoiding mankind. His formidable apparatus not only served his tastes, but for some terrible vengeance. At this time nothing is clear to me. I can only grope in the dark, and only write, so to speak, under the dictation of events. Furthermore, nothing binds us to Captain Nemo. He knows that escape from the Nautilus is impossible. We're not even prisoners on parole. No promise binds us. We are merely captives, prisoners called guests by courtesy. Ned Land has never given up the idea of recovering his liberty. He will surely take advantage of the very first opportunity that chance may throw in his way. I shall do the same. Nevertheless, it will not be without a sense of regret that I shall carry away with me all the mystery of the Nautilus, that the captain's kindness has permitted me to penetrate. For, after all, was he a man to be hated or admired? Was he a victim or an executioner? And then, to be frank, I would like, before I quitted the vessel forever, to finish this tour of the submarine world whose opening scenes are so splendid. I should like to see the marvels scattered beneath the seas, to behold what man has never yet seen, even if I pay by my life for this insatiable desire for knowledge. What have I discovered so far? Nothing, or scarcely more than nothing, since we have only travelled 6,000 leagues across the Pacific. Still, I know very well that the Nautilus is approaching some inhabited land, and that if chance befriend us, it would be cruel to sacrifice my companions to my passion for discovery. I must follow, perhaps lead them. But would the opportunity ever present itself? The man, forcibly deprived of his liberty, wishes for it. The connoisseur, the savant, fears it. On the 21st of January, 1868, at midday, the mate came up to take the sun's altitude. I was on the platform, and, lighting a cigar, I watched the operation. It seemed evident to me that this man did not understand French, for I often spoke my thoughts aloud, and the very words would have drawn from him some involuntary sign of attention if he had understood the language, but he remained impassible and silent. While he was taking the observation, one of the sailors, the same who had accompanied us in our first excursion to the island of Crespo, came to rub up the lantern glasses. I then examined the fixing of this apparatus, whose power is multiplied by lenticular rings, arranged as in lighthouses, and which keep the light in the horizontal plane. The electric lamp was so arranged as to yield all its illuminating power. The light was produced in a vacuum, so the regularity and intensity were assured at the same time. By these means, the points of graphite between which the light was developed were economized. This economy was very important for Captain Nemo, who could not easily renew the points. But under these conditions, the expenditure was almost insensible. As soon as the Nautilus was ready to recommence her submarine journey, I descended to the saloon. The panels were shut down and the course directed to the west. We skimmed through the waves of the Indian Ocean, a vast liquid plain containing 550 millions of hectares, and the water is so transparent as to make those giddy who lean over them. The Nautilus usually floated at a depth of between 100 and 200 yards, so we passed many days. To anyone but myself, who is so passionately fond of the sea, the hours would have appeared, no doubt, long and wearisome. But the daily walks upon the platform, where I was able to drink in the healthy sea air, the sight of the teeming waters through the crystal side panels of the saloon, the books, the editing of my memoirs, engaged all my time, and did not leave me a moment for lassitude or ennui. The health of the whole ship's company was still extremely good. The food suited us perfectly, and, for my own part, I could well have dispensed with the variations which Ned Land, in his spirit of protestation, studied hard to supply. Besides, in this even temperature we had no fear of catching cold, while the madrepore dendrophil, known in Provence as the sea fennel, and of which a supply remained on board, furnished us by the melted flesh of its polyps with an excellent remedy against coughs. We saw great numbers of aquatic birds as we proceeded. There were palimpeds, sea mews and gulls, some of which we shot and prepared in a particular way, furnished us with an acceptable supply of water game. Amongst the larger birds, which had flown long distances and were resting upon the water, I perceived a magnificent albatross, whose discordant cry is not unlike a donkey's bray. It belonged to the family of Longipens. The family of Totipalms was represented by the frigate birds, which rapidly brought the fish to the surface, and by a number of phaetons, or tropic birds, some as large as a pigeon. And of this kind, the red-tipped variety, the white plumage is shaded with rose colour, which sets off the dark tints of the wings. The nets captured many sorts of marine tortoise of the convex bax genus, the shell of which is much sought after. These reptiles, which dive easily, can remain a long time under water by shutting the valve of flesh situated at the external orifice of the nose. Some of them, when taken, were still asleep beneath the marine animals. The flesh of these tortoises was generally only middling, but their eggs were most excellent. The fish continually roused our admiration as we watched them through the open side panels of the vessel. I remarked here many species that I had not seen before. I will notice principally the Austrasians native to the Red Sea, to the Indian Sea, and to that portion of the ocean which washes the coasts of equatorial America. These fish, like the tortoise, the turtle, the echinus, the crustacea, are protected by a cuirass which is neither cretaceous nor stony, but actually bony. Sometimes this covering takes the form of a triangular solid, sometimes of a quadrilateral form. Amongst the former kind I noticed some of the length of 1.5 inches, the flesh most wholesome and of pleasant taste. The tail was brown, fins yellow, and I recommend the acclimatization of these fishes in fresh water, to which some sea fish soon accustom themselves. There were also quadrangular ostracions, bearing 4 large tubercles on the back. The spotted ostracions, with white spots on the belly, which grow as tame as birds. The trigons, provided with prickles formed by the prolongation of their bony covering. These fish have been dubbed sea pigs on account of the singular grunting noise they emit. Then there were the dromedary fish, with large humps, whose flesh is hard and coarse. I also extract from the notes taken daily by Conseil certain fish of the Tetradon genus, peculiar to the seas with red backs and white bellies, which are marked by 3 longitudinal rows of filaments, and electric eels 7 feet in length, adorned with most beautiful colours. Then, as specimens of other genus, there were ovoids like a brownish-black egg, striped with white bands, and tailless. Distons, regular sea porcupines furnished with quills and able to swell themselves out so as to present the appearance of a ball bristling with spikes. The sea horses common to all oceans, the flying pegasus with long snouts and with their pectoral fins so elongated and disposed in the form of wings that they can almost fly, at least rise into the air. Pigeon spatulae, whose tails are covered with numerous scaly rings. Macronades with long jaws, excellent fish 25 centimeters long and shining with various colours. Pale calliomores with red heads, myriads of blennies, striped with black and shooting to the surface with prodigious velocity, aided by their long pectoral fins. The Trecopteres, whose wings are formed of filaments. Trigals, whose liver is considered poison. Bodians, which wear a movable blinker on the eyes, and, finally, the blowfish, or catodons, having a long tubular snout, flycatchers armed with a gun which neither chasepots nor Remingtons can beat, and which kill the insects by shooting a drop of water at them. In the 89th genus of fishes classified by Lacépède, which belongs to the second subclass of Ossians, characterized by an operculum and a bronchial membrane, I remarked the Scorpina, the head of which is furnished with spikes, and which only possesses a single dorsal fin. These animals are supplied with or deficient of scales according to the subgenus to which they belong. The second subgenus gives us specimens of didactyls, 13 or 14 inches in length, striped with yellow, with very odd-looking heads. The first subgenus furnishes many specimens of a curious fish justly named the sea frog. It is a large-headed fish, sometimes shrunken, sometimes puffed out, bristling with spines, and sprinkled with tubercles. It has irregular and ugly horns. Its tail and body are furnished with a hard skin. Its prickles inflict dangerous wounds, and it is altogether horrible and repugnant. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, the Nautilus steamed at the rate of 250 leagues in 24 hours. That is to say, 540 miles or 22 miles an hour. Any fish we recognized on the passage were those which were attracted by our electric light. The greater number were speedily distanced, but some managed to keep up with the Nautilus for a time. On the morning of the 24th, in south latitude 12 degrees 5 minutes, longitude 94 degrees 33 minutes, we sighted the Isle of Keeling, planted with magnificent coconut trees. It was formed by the madrepores and was visited by Mr. Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. Apologies, I'm struggling with a tickle. The Nautilus gave the shores of this desert island a wide berth. We brought up in the drags numerous specimens of polypi and echinoderms, and some curious shells of mollusks. Some beautiful specimens of the delphinale species were added to Captain Nemo's treasures, to which I contributed an Astrea punctifera, a sort of polypi parasite often fixed upon a shell. Keeling Island soon disappeared, and we steered northwest towards the southern point of Hindustan. Some civilized territory, said Ned, would be better than these islands, where there are more savages than goats. In India, sir, there are roads, railways, towns inhabited by English, French, and Hindus. One could not go for 5 miles without meeting a fellow countryman. Is not this the time to stir up Captain Nemo's sense of politeness? No, Ned, I replied in a determined tone. Let us go as we are. The Nautilus is approaching habitable continents. We are returning towards Europe. Once arrived in our own seas, we shall see what prudence suggests as best to be done. Besides, I do not suppose that Captain Nemo would permit us to go ashore to hunt upon the coasts of Malabar or Coromandel as we did in the forests of New Guinea. But cannot we go without leave? I made no reply, for I did not wish to discuss this point. At heart, I was ready to go through the adventures to the end. After leaving Keeling Island, our progress was slower and more erratic, leading us at times to great depths. The inclined planes were often used, which levers within the vessel placed obliquely to the line of flotation. We went in this manner for about 2 miles, but without ever reaching the enormous depths of the Indian Sea, in which sounding lines of 7,000 fathoms have not touched bottom. The temperature of the low zones is always 4 degrees above zero. I observed, however, that in the upper zones the water was always colder in the high levels than in the open sea. On the 25th of January, the ocean was absolutely deserted. The Nautilus passed the whole day at the surface, knocking up great waves with her powerful screw. Who would not, under these circumstances, have mistaken her for an enormous cetacean? I passed the greater portion of the day upon the platform looking at the sea. There was nothing in sight till about 4 p.m. We saw a large steamer running westward on the opposite tack. Her masts were for an instant visible, but she could not perceive the Nautilus, which was so low in the water. I fancied that this steamer belonged to the Peninsular and Oriental Company, plying between Ceylon and Sydney, touching at King George's Point in Melbourne. At 5 p.m, before quickly passing twilight, which joins day and night in tropical countries, Conseil and I were astonished by a very curious sight. It was a pretty animal we saw, the appearance of which, according to the ancients, betokened good luck. Aristotle, Pliny, etc. had studied its habits and exhausted in respect of it all the poetry of the savants of Greece and Italy. They called them Nautilus and Pompilius, but modern science has not endorsed these appellations, and the mollusk is now known as the Argonaut. If anyone had consulted Conseil, he would have told them that the mollusks are divided into 5 classes. That the first class, that of the cephaloids, are shellless sometimes tentacular, and includes 2 families, the Dibranchiae and the Tetrabranchiae. The former family includes 3 genus, the Argonaut, the Calmar, and the Seiche, while the other has only 1 genus, the Nautilus. If, after this distinction, anyone confuses the Argonaut, which is a cetabulifer, or air carriers, with the Nautilus, which is tentaculifer, or carrying tentacles, there can be no excuse for him. Now this was a shoal of Argonauts which were sailing along. We could reckon them by hundreds. They belonged to the Tubercular Argonauts, which are peculiar to the Indian seas. These graceful mollusks moved backward by means of expelling the water they had aspired. Of their 8 tentacles, 6 long and thin floated in the water, while the others, rolled up in a rounded, flattened form, were extended to the wind and acted as sails. I could easily see the spiral and undulating shells, which Cuvier justly compares to an elegant boat. A boat indeed, for it bears the animal without the animal being fixed to it. The Argonaut is free to quit its shell, I said to Conseil, but it does not do so. "Just like Captain Nemo," replied Conseil judiciously. "Perhaps it would be better to have called this vessel the Argonaut." For about an hour the Nautilus was surrounded by this shoal of mollusks. Suddenly they took alarm, I know not why. At a signal, all the sails were furled, the arms were folded, the bodies contracted. The shells, turning over, changed the centre of gravity, and the whole fleet disappeared beneath the waves. It was instantaneous, and no ships in the navy could execute a manoeuvre with greater smartness. Night now fell, and the waves, scarcely ruffled by the breeze, rolled quietly alongside the Nautilus. The following day we crossed the equator at the 82nd meridian and passed into the northern hemisphere. During the day, a formidable tribe of sharks kept us company. Terrible animals they are, and render these seas very dangerous. These were the Philippi species, with brown backs and whitish bellies, having 11 rows of teeth. The eyed sharks, which have a great black patch surrounded by white on their backs, which resembles an eye, and the Isabelle sharks, their round backs spotted with black. These powerful animals often struck the glass panels of the saloon with a violence that was rather alarming. Excuse me, just lost my place. At those times Ned Land got very impatient. He wanted to go up to the surface and harpoon some of the monsters, and some, whose mouths were studded with teeth disposed like a mosaic, and enormous tiger sharks 5 yards long at least, provoked him incessantly. But the Nautilus increased her speed and soon left the most rapid of the sharks astern. On the 27th of January, opening up the Bay of Bengal, we repeatedly encountered a horrible sight. Dead bodies which were floating in the surface. These were the dead from the Indian towns on the Ganges, in which the vultures, the only scavengers of the country, had not been able to devour. But the sharks had no need of assistance in their horrid banquet. About 7 p.m. the Nautilus, half immerged, was ploughing through a sea of milk. As far as one could see, the ocean appeared to be covered with milk. Was this the effect of the lunar rays? No, for the moon was scarcely 2 days old, and was still below the horizon. The whole sky, although illuminated by the sheen of the stars, appeared dark in contrast with the whiteness of the sea. Conseil could not believe his eyes, and inquired the cause of this singular phenomenon. Fortunately, I was able to answer. "It is what is called a milk sea," I replied, "a vast expanse of white waves which is frequently observed upon the coasts of Amboyna and in these latitudes." "But," said Conseil, "Monsieur will perhaps inform me what is the cause of this, for I do not imagine that the sea is changed to milk." "No, my lad, this whiteness which astonishes you is due to the presence of myriads of Infusoria, a kind of luminous worm, gelatinous and colourless, about as thick as a hair and not more than 7/1000th of an inch in length. Some of these animals adhere to each other for many leagues." "For many leagues?" exclaimed Conseil. "Yes, and do not seek to ascertain the number of these Infusoria. You will never arrive at it, for, if I do not mistake, people have sailed through these milk seas for more than 40 miles. I do not know whether Conseil attended to my advice, but he seemed to be deep in thought, seeking, no doubt, to calculate how many 7/1000th of an inch were contained in 40 square miles. I continued to observe the phenomenon. For many hours the Nautilus drove through these white waves, but towards midnight the sea resumed its usual appearance. But behind us, as far as we could see, the sky, tinged by the reflection from the waves, seemed to be covered with an indistinct gleam of the aurora borealis. Chapter 2. A Novel Proposition of Captain Nemo. On the 28th of February, when the Nautilus came up to the surface, in 9 degrees 4 minutes north latitude, we were in view of land about 8 miles westward. I noticed first a range of mountains about 2,000 feet high, whose forms were very uneven. After our position had been ascertained and reported, I found that we were close to Ceylon, the pearl which hangs from the lobe of the Indian peninsula. I searched in the library for some books about this island, which is one of the most fertile in the world. I found a volume entitled Ceylon and the Cingalese. At that moment Captain Nemo appeared with the mate. The captain cast a hasty glance at the map. Then, turning to me, he said, "Ceylon is celebrated for its pearl fisheries. Would you like to visit one of them?" "Very much indeed, Captain," I replied. "Well then, that is easily managed. Only, if we go to the fishery, we must go as fishermen. The annual search has not yet commenced, but never mind. I will give orders to pull up in the Gulf of Mannar, where we shall arrive during the night." The captain then said something to his mate, who went out immediately. The Nautilus soon descended again and remained at a depth of about 30 feet. Map in hand, I searched for the Gulf of Mannar. I descried it in the 9th parallel on the northeast coast of Ceylon. "Professor Aronnax," said Captain Nemo, "pearls are found in the Bay of Bengal in the Indian Ocean, in Japanese and Chinese seas, and in the South American waters, in the Gulfs of Panama and California, but it is at Ceylon that this fishery obtains the best results. We shall soon get there. The divers only assemble in March in the Gulf of Mannar, and there for 30 days their 300 boats reap a glorious harvest. Each boat is fitted for 6 rowers and 6 divers. These in 2 parties descend alternately to a depth of more than 150 feet by means of a heavy stone, which they retain between their feet, and which is fastened to the boat by a rope." "This," said I, "was the primitive method. Is it still used?" "Yes," replied the captain, "even now when the fisheries belong to the English, to whom they were ceded by the Treaty of Amiens in 1802. "It seems to me, Captain, that the diver's dress you have would suffice in this expedition." "Yes, for the poor fishes cannot remain long underwater. Perceval, an Englishman, in his travels in Ceylon, spoke highly of a calf who remained for 5 minutes under water, but I can scarcely credit it. I know that some divers can stay for 57 seconds, and very skilful ones for 87, which is very seldom done, and when they return to the boat these unfortunate fellows bleed from the nose and ears. I believe the average time these divers can exist underwater to be 30 seconds, during which time they detach all the pearl oysters they can seize. But these men do not live long as a rule. They are weakened, ulcers form in their eyes, sores come upon their bodies, and they are frequently seized with apoplexy at the bottom of the sea." "Yes," I replied, "it is an unpleasant avocation, and only to satisfy a caprice. But what numbers of oysters can a boat capture during the day?" "From 40,000 to 50,000. It is said that in 1814, the English government, having taken the fishing on its own account, the divers during 20 days' working brought up 76 million of oysters." "Well, at any rate, these fishers are well paid?" "Not at all. In Panama they make only $1 a week. More frequently they receive a halfpenny for every pearl oyster. And how many do they bring up which contain no pearl?" "A halfpenny for these poor people who enrich their masters. It is iniquitous." "Well, monsieur, you and your companion shall visit the Mannar Bank, and if by chance we find some early fisher there, we will see him at work." "That's a bargain, Captain. By the by, Monsieur Aronnax, are you afraid of sharks?" "Sharks!" I exclaimed. This appeared a somewhat difficult question to me at least. "Well?" asked the captain. "I must confess," I said, "that I am not yet familiar with that genus." "Well, the people here are accustomed to them, and so will you be in time. Besides, we are armed, and as we go along we may perhaps have a shark hunt. It is a very interesting occupation. So, tomorrow, monsieur, and very early." And saying this in an airy manner, Captain Nemo quitted the saloon. If you were invited to a bear hunt on the Swiss mountains, what would you say? "Well, tomorrow we will go bear hunting." If asked to hunt lions on the plains of the Atlas or the tiger in an Indian jungle, you would reply, "All right, it seems we are going to hunt the lion or the tiger," as the case may be. But if you were asked to hunt the shark in his native element, you would perhaps request a little time to consider before accepting the polite invitation. I passed my hand over my forehead as I mused, and found it covered with cold perspiration. "Let us think this over," I said to myself, "and take our time. To hunt otters, as we did in the forest of the Isle of Crespo, is one thing, but to go down to the bottom of the sea, where one is nearly certain to encounter sharks, is another. I know very well that in some places, the Andaman Islands for instance, the natives do not hesitate to attack the sharks, a dagger in one hand, a lasso in the other, but I also am aware that many of the venture some individuals never return. Besides, I am not a native, and even if I were, I do not think a little hesitation would be at all out of place under the circumstances." And so I dreamt of sharks, and their vast jaws armed with rows of teeth, capable of snapping a man in half. I already began to experience a curiously unpleasant sensation about the waist. I could not understand the easy way in which the captain had given this deplorable invitation. He had said it in much the same way as one would ask you to go fox hunting. However, I thought, Conseil will not want to go, and that will give me an excuse to let the captain go without me. As for Ned Land, I was obliged to confess that I was not so sure of his sagacity. Any peril, however great, had always an attraction for his bellicose nature. So I returned to my book on Ceylon, but between the lines I could perceive the formidable jaws opening still. At this moment Conseil and Ned returned with a quite cheerful air. They knew little what was in store for them. "Faith, monsieur, your Captain Nemo, may the devil take him, has made us a very nice offer." "Ah," I exclaimed, "you know, if monsieur has no objection," replied Conseil, "the captain has asked us to accompany monsieur to the magnificent pearl fisheries of Ceylon. He made the suggestion like a gentleman." "He said nothing more than that?" "Nothing," replied Ned, "except that he has spoken to you on the subject." "So, in fact, he gave you no details?" "None. You will accompany us, won't you?" "I? Certainly. I perceive you like the idea, Master Land?" "Yes, it is curious, very curious." "A little dangerous, perhaps?" I insinuated. "Dangerous?" exclaimed Ned. "A little excursion on an oyster bank. Dangerous!" It was evident that Captain Nemo had decided that it would be useless to wake the idea of sharks in the minds of my companions. I already looked upon them with a pitying glance, as if they had lost a limb. Ought I to warn them? Yes, doubtless, but I did not know quite how to set about it. "Monsieur," said Conseil, "will monsieur tell us how they set about this oyster fishing?" "The fishing itself, or the incident connected with it?" "About the fishing," said the Canadian. "Before getting to the ground, we ought to know something of it." "Well, then, if you will sit down, I will tell you all I have read upon the subject." Ned and Conseil took their seats, and suddenly the Canadian asked, "What is a pearl?" "My brave Ned," I replied, "to a poet a pearl is a tear of the sea. To the Orientals it is a solidified dewdrop. To ladies it is a jewel of oblong shape, of a material like mother of pearl, which they wear on the finger, the neck, or ears. For the chemist it is a mixture of the phosphate and the carbonate of lime with a little gelatin. And finally, for naturalists, it is merely a morbid secretion of the organ which produces the mother of pearl in some bivalves. Branch of mollusca, class Acephali, order Testacea," said Conseil. "Precisely, Professor Conseil. Now amongst these Testacea, the sea ear iris, the turbot, the Tredinae, and all those which secrete the mother of pearl, that is to say, the blue, bluish-violet, or white substance which lines the interior of their shells, are not unlikely to produce pearls." "And mussels also?" asked the Canadian. "Yes, mussels in certain districts of the coast of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, and France." "Ah, in future I will pay them a little attention," replied Ned. "But," I said, "the mollusk that really forms the pearl is the pearl oyster, the Meleagrina margaritifera pintadines. Wow. The pearl is only a nacreous concretion which is disposed in a globular shape. It adheres to the oyster shell, or encrusts itself in the body of the animal. Upon the shells the pearl adheres, in the flesh it is loose. but in any case it possesses a little hard nucleus, which may be a barren egg, a grain of sand around which the nacreous matter has been disposed during many years by delicate and concentric layers. Are many pearls found in the oyster? Asked Conseil. Yes. There are certain pintadines which form a regular casket of pearls. I have heard of an oyster, though I rather doubt the story, which contains no less than 150 sharks. 150 sharks! Exclaimed Ned. Did I say sharks? I cried quickly. I meant pearls. Sharks would be absurd. Of course, said Conseil, but Monsieur has not yet told us how the pearls are obtained. In many ways, and frequently when the pearls adhere to the shells, the divers tear them with pincers. But more commonly, the pintadines are extended on the esparto fibres which are laid on the banks. They then die in the open air, and at the end of 10 days they are in a satisfactory state of putrefaction. They are then thrown into large reservoirs of salt water, and are then opened and washed. At this period the real labour of the sorters begins. First they separate the layers of mother of pearl, known in commerce as franche argentée, bastard whites and bastard blacks, which are sent off in cases of 200 or 300 pounds each. The parenchyma of the oyster is then raised, boiled and sifted for the pearls. I suppose pearls vary in price according to size, said Conseil. Not only according to size, but according to shape and the water or colour of their orient, that is, the shot-coloured hue which is so beautiful. The most beautiful are called virgin pearls, or paragons. They form only in the tissue of the mollusk. They are white, often opaque, but sometimes of an opaline clearness, and more usually oval or rounded. The spherical pearls are made into bracelets, the oval into pendants, and, being the most valuable, they are sold singly. The other pearls adhere to the oyster shell, and, not being so good, are sold by weight. Finally, in the inferior class come the small pearls, known as seed pearls, which are sold by the measure and are chiefly used to embroider church furniture. But is it a long or difficult job to separate the pearls according to size? Asked Ned. No, this work is performed by means of sieves or screens or of various meshes. The pearls that remain in the largest sieves are reckoned of the first class. Those that do not pass through the medium screens are counted in the second class, and those are called seed pearls, for which the smallest sieves pierced with 900 to 1,000 holes are used. It is ingenious, but I see the classing of pearls is only a mechanical operation, said Conseil. But can Monsieur tell us what the cultivation of oyster beds yields to the owner? According to my information, the annual value of the Ceylon fisheries is 3 millions of sharks. Of francs, I suppose, said the Canadian. I mean francs, 3 millions of francs. But I do not think the fisheries yield as much as formerly. It is the same with the American beds, and in fact we may estimate 9 millions as the whole value of the pearl fisheries. But are there not some celebrated pearls which command a very high price? Yes, my lad. They say Caesar offered Servilia a pearl estimated at 120,000 francs of our money. I have even heard it stated that some woman of antiquity used to drink pearls dissolved in vinegar, said Ned. Cleopatra, replied Conseil. That must have been very unpleasant, added Ned. Detestable, friend Ned. And a little glass of vinegar that cost 1.5 million francs was dear. I am sorry I didn't marry that woman, said the Canadian, raising his arm in a menacing manner. Ned Land, Cleopatra's husband, exclaimed Conseil. But I ought to marry Conseil, and that is not the fault of the business, and that is not my fault that the business has not come off. I have even purchased a necklace of pearls for Kate Tender, my fiancée, who meanwhile married somebody else. The necklace cost only $1.50, and yet, if Monsieur will believe me, the pearls would not have passed through the biggest sieve. My good Ned, I said, laughing, they were artificial pearls, simple glass drops filled with essence of Orient. Is that expensive? Asked the Canadian. Not at all. It is only the silvery substance of the scales of the bleak collected in the water and preserved in ammonia. It has no value. Perhaps that is the reason why Kate married the other fellow, said Ned philosophically. But, said I, to return to our high-priced pearls, I do not believe any sovereign has ever passed any so valuable as those Captain Nemo has. This, said Conseil, indicating a splendid one in a glass case. Certainly. I do not think I am wrong in estimating it as worth 2 millions of francs, said Conseil quickly. Yes, 2 millions of francs, and I dare say that sum would not repay the captain for the trouble of obtaining it. Eh? Said Ned, but who knows that we may not get such another tomorrow? Bah, said Conseil. Why not? What would be the use of millions to us here? On board? No, but otherwise. Oh, otherwise, echoed Conseil with an upward toss of his head. Master Land is right, though, said I, and if we could bring back to Europe a pearl worth a few millions, there will be at least once a proof of the truth and success of our expedition. I believe it, said the Canadian. But, said Conseil, who always came back to the instructive side of things, is this pearl fishing dangerous? No, said I quickly, not if you take proper care. What risks do you run? Asked Ned. The taste of some mouthfuls of sea water. Just so, Ned. By the by, are you afraid of sharks? I asked this in as airy a tone as I could assume. I, exclaimed Ned, a harpooner by profession? Why, I laugh at them. But, said I, it is not the question of fishing for them, hauling them on board the ship and cutting them up, and throwing the heart into the sea. Then it is... Yes, exactly. In the water? Yes. In the water. Faith, with a stout harpoon, I don't know. You understand that these sharks are very ill-made beasts. They must turn on their backs to snap you up, and, meantime... Ned's way of pronouncing snap you up made my blood run cold. Very well. And Conseil, what do you think of the sharks? I will be frank with monsieur, he said. So much the better, I thought. If monsieur will encounter the sharks, his faithful servant will also encounter them by his side. And that brings us to the end of the chapter, and I think where I shall finish things for tonight. So thank you for listening.